start by introducing myself. My name is Amelia. I'm the assistant site manager here at the President James K. Polk State Historic Site. That is a mouthful of a name to say, especially over the phone, and sometimes I do forget a few words. So I haven't been here for very long. I've been here since about December of last year, so it's been 6-7 months so far. A good experience. That's my son in the back there. He's operating the camera and he's making faces at me. So I'll do my best to get through this without laughing. Yeah. Okay, so here to talk to you all a little bit about the Enslaved Polks Project. Now this is an ongoing project. It's been going for about almost 5 years now, 4.5, 5 years. So I'm relatively new to the project, and quite a few other people have contributed their wealth of knowledge as well. But what it does is it's an online project, online digital project. You can access it on our website. It tries to research as many of the people enslaved by the Polk family as possible, especially people enslaved by James K. Polk. So it's very broad in the scope, and there's a lot of different names in this project. It's just a way of giving people their identities back. All right, so these are some of the past contributors. I just have their names up here to give them credit. I don't want you all to think that I did all of this research by myself. I have added to the project since I started, but I was very blessed to have a good foundation to work off of. So that's what these people have definitely contributed to. So when I started in December, I was given the project of designing a wayside. A wayside is an outdoor sign that talks about, whatever. In our case, something historical. We wanted to have a wayside that talked about some of the enslaved folks who were here on this property. So for me, this was pretty easy to do. I have an art background. I was a gallery curator for 7 years before coming here. Designed a lot of things just like this. So I got this done relatively quickly. The text was already written for me. All I had to do was make it look pretty, which I think I did. I really like it. So I sent that to my boss, Scott, and he bumped it up to his supervision. They also liked it, but then they were like, hey, we don't think there is enough here. We want you to tell more of the story of each of these people. To which we were like, we're limited to 250 words here, so how much more can we put? And this is about 250 words right here. Might be 251 by the time we were done with it. So it's like, well, okay. So, and then I also was a little bit hesitant to even start the project or try to do more research. So I felt like, all these amazing historians before me have already researched this project. What else is there to find, if anything? But I decided to go back and at least verify information. That's always a good place to start. And I did actually find some new information, which was really exciting. Also, as I got into it, I found that I had a few advantages that maybe some of the past researchers hadn't had. Like, for one thing, very new to the project. I haven't been working on it for 5 years, so I brought that fresh perspective and fresh energy to it, which sometimes for these projects that drag on, it's just good to have that. I also had the pleasure of meeting this man. He came here in February of this year. His name's Zachary Kinslow. He's the director of the Clement Railroad Hotel Museum in Tennessee. He is probably the world's only expert on Elias Polk. Elias Polk is this man over here in this picture. He was born on this property as an enslaved person, born to an enslaved mother. He's an expert on this person, so it was really great to have access to him, get to learn from him, and still being able to call or email him as needed throughout my research. Also, where the Enslaved Polks Project really is very broad in scope, like I said, lots and lots of names, I was asked to only focus on 3 people, mainly 3 people. There's a few other names that you'll see as we go on, but primarily everything stems from either Lucy, Elias, or Violet. So having more of a focus really helped drive this project, and I was able to uncover some new information about at least Lucy and Violet. Elias, we already knew quite a bit about, as you will see as we go on. Some methodology. This type of project, you really get into the primary sources. Now, primary sources are going to be things like letters, sometimes photographs, not so much for this project. Last wills and testaments, tax records, census records, things like that. So those are the types of documents I was looking at. We're very fortunate that James K. Polk was a president. So this means there was a much more of an interest in preserving a lot of his documentation. So a lot of his letters and correspondences are actually online through the University of, I believe, Knoxville, Tennessee. They've made most of these available online, which is very helpful for someone who's researching different people. And slave owners were very often talking about their enslaved in their letters. In their minds, they were assets. It was, do we sell them? Do we need to buy more? Do we move one person from this property to this property? Oh, so-and-so ran away. Let's go find them. Things like that. You see a lot of that in their letters, more often than not. Okay, so we're going to start at the beginning of the story. So, in the beginning, we start with Violet and Lucy, the two women who actually came to this property first before anybody else did. Now, these two, we don't know if they were sisters or related in some way, but we do know that they came from the Hopewell area of Mecklenburg County. So this is going to be like Huntersville. If you're familiar with Lotta Nature Preserve, Hopewell Presbyterian Church is up there. It's kind of that area. So that's where they came from. They belonged to James K. Polk's maternal grandfather, James Knox. This is actually who James K. Polk is named for. James K. stands for James Knox. So, James Knox was his mother, Jane's father. Now, James Knox, unfortunately, he died shortly before his daughter's wedding. So James Knox passes away in October. Jane marries Samuel, James K. Polk's father, in December. So, as sad as this was, it actually worked out pretty well for Jane because she ended up getting her inheritance a little bit early. So her inheritance included things like household items, a mare named Silver, and two little enslaved girls named Violet and Lucy. So you have a quote here. I will bequeath to my beloved daughter Jane two Negro girls named Violet and Lou. Sometimes we do see Lucy referred to as Lou, sometimes as Luce, L-U-C-E, but we are confident this is the same person. I will call her Lucy throughout the presentation. So Violet and Lucy were probably around 7 or 8 years old at this time. So Samuel had been building his home here on this property, South Mecklenburg County. So this means that Violet and Lucy were removed from their home. The reality of this is they were probably taken away from their parents as well, other family members, maybe other siblings, and brought to live here as very young girls. And you know, today we can do this trip by car in about 30 minutes. If there's traffic, I don't know, you might never get there, but it's relatively quick. In Violet and Lucy's time, this was a multiple-day journey. So the idea of maybe going back to see your parents from time to time probably wasn't very often, if it ever happened. So they really were separated and put into this new place where they had to learn a lot really quickly. Back then, wagons could really only travel about 5 to 10 miles a day. A horse and rider could probably do it in a day, but you definitely weren't sending two little girls off into the wilds of Mecklenburg County on their own. But you wouldn't do that today, really for different reasons. But they really were here. And Samuel and Jane, they were married on Christmas Day, 1795, and that's how they got their life started here on this property. Now, I do want to point out that we do know there were a total of 5 people who were enslaved on this property. 2 of them we don't know much about, unfortunately. So that's why we focus mostly on Lucy, Violet, and Elias. We do know that in 1806, we know from Mecklenburg County tax records that Samuel had 2 additional enslaved people on this property who he hadn't had listed on his previous tax records. They were probably men. We don't know for sure. All we really know about them is this designation of BP, which stands for Black persons, male and female, aged between 12 and 50. So, it's more likely they were men. Samuel's farm had grown in the years that he had lived here. Excuse me. And he probably needed manpower to help work these fields a little bit more. And the women were more likely more in the domestic role. From that, we do come to conclude that some combination of these 4 people produced a baby boy, Elias. Now I know you're looking at that picture and thinking that doesn't look like a baby, that's a grown man. Well, yes, it is. Elias, he grows up to be a politician. So we do actually have a real portrait of him. This is actually him, whereas with the other enslaved people, we don't know what they looked like. So I do use his picture here because it is an actual approximate likeness of what he looked like. And this is the Mecklenburg County tax record. You can see Polk Samuel here. That number 330, that's the number of acres he had in his land holdings. 1 is for his own census record, and then the number 4 is the accounting of the number of slaves he had in 1806. Now, Elias was born in 1806, but because he's under the age of 12, he isn't counted in the Mecklenburg County tax records or in the census. And that varies state to state a little bit. All right, so the Polk family, they were here for 11 years, and then they go from Charlotte to Columbia, Tennessee. So, and today this is maybe a 7 or 8 hour trip by car. In Polk's time, it probably took them months. And they probably walked a lot of the way too. So when you think about it, you got a wagon full of people, might actually move a little bit faster if you're on foot, and then the animals can go a little bit faster too. We're going to start with Violet's story first. Hers is probably the easiest to tell, but we do know she goes from Charlotte to Columbia with the family, and it seems like she does stay in Columbia for the rest of her life. But let's go through her story first. We already know James Knox dies, and that's how Violet is transferred to Jane Polk upon her wedding. Then in 1806, they moved to Columbia. But then in 1826, Samuel Polk dies, and this is the next time that we see Violet mentioned in his will. So you can kind of see, this is just a photograph of the part of his will that mentions Violet. And you can see her name right there. You'll see that? She shows up in a few other places as well. But she was bequeathed to Samuel Polk's son, Samuel W. Polk. Or I'm sorry, no, she actually stayed with Jane Polk, and Violet's daughters were bequeathed to Samuel W. Polk. They like to reuse names back then. Makes it very confusing when you're researching these things to figure out who is who. So this is a part of the will that talks about Violet's daughters, Dolly and Mary. So we do know she had at least 2 daughters. She might have had more children. We don't know. Elias might have been her son too. We don't know. We just don't know for sure. There's a lot of details that are left out of this. But you can see the name Dolly over here on your left, and Mary, daughters of Violet. So that's how we know she had 2 daughters. So those 2, they go to Samuel W. Polk. Then in 1839, Samuel W. Polk dies. So the Polks, I should say, they had 10 children, 5 of whom were born on this property, all of whom made it to adulthood, but there are some that do die relatively young in adulthood. Samuel W. would be one of those. So when he dies, he leaves Dolly and Mary, and by this time, Dolly has a child named Elias, not to be confused with this Elias. See, we're also reusing names here as well. So not to be confused with this Elias, the different Elias here. And then Samuel W. wills the girls, or the women at this point, and baby Elias to his brother William H. Polk. William H. is a bit of a black sheep of the family. He falls into some financial struggles. He also loses his wife tragically at some point as well, and just really has a hard time getting back on his feet again. Also, fun fact, if you walked around the museum, we do have a Mexican War uniform of William H. Polk, just on the other side of this wall, though. This is one of the original artifacts that we have here. So, William H., to solve some of his financial problems, he sells Dolly and Dolly's children to his in-laws, Dr. and Mrs. Dickinson. So this actually sparks a bit of a reaction from the Polk family, specifically Jane Polk. She did not appreciate the fact that William H. sold any of the enslaved people who were born in her household outside the family. And this is going to cause then President Polk to actually put up some money to buy Dolly and her children back for his mother, to serve her for the rest of her life. So what you see on the screen is a correspondence from James K. Polk to his mother, stating that he is going to purchase Dolly and her children back for his mother, Jane. But he did, and that would have been in the first year of his presidency that he did that. Now, presidents didn't make a whole lot of money back then, but he found the funds necessary to do that. And that is when we lose track of Dolly, children. No mention of Violet either, so perhaps Violet died in 1826 when Samuel Polk did. We don't know. There's no evidence that she was sold or anything like that, but we do lose track of her and her daughters after this. Now, we can talk about Lucy's story. Lucy's is a little bit more complicated than Violet's. So Violet had quite a bit more stability, I would say. She moved from Charlotte to Columbia, seems to stay there, seems to stay in one place. Lucy, on the other hand, gets moved all over the place. She ends up at James K. Polk's plantation in Somerville, Tennessee. Conditions were horrible there. 2 of her children die while she's there. And then she is moved to James K. Polk's other plantation in Yallabusha, Mississippi, more specifically Coffeyville, Mississippi. And that is where Lucy will eventually pass away as well. She was around late 40s, early 50s when she died. So let's talk about her story. So this is a photocopy of James Knox's will, where he is leaving Violet and Lou to his daughter Jane. I do like to put the primary sources up on the screen so you can actually see them as much as possible, even though they are a little bit hard to read. I don't know, anyone good at reading old-timey handwriting? I mean, it's a developing skill. But what it says is, I will and bequeath to my beloved daughter Jane 2 Negro girls named Violet and Lou. And then after that, it's a list of other household goods and property. So they're listed as if they were property, like a chair, like a bed, like a wagon. Okay, this is how people talked about the enslaved back in the 19th century, and before as well. All right, so Lucy's story is very similar to Violet. Starts in Charlotte, moves to Columbia. 1826, Samuel Polk dies. Now we do know from Samuel Polk's will that Lucy was married to a man named Charlie, and she had several children, at least 2, Leander and Barbary, also called Barbara in a lot of the texts. Now, I use the word married here a bit loosely because marriages were not legal between the enslaved people. But I do feel like it's okay to use it here because in the primary sources, Lucy is always referred to as Charlie's wife and he as her husband. So I think they were regarded as married by their enslavers. Also, we don't know who baby Charlie is. He is not listed as being one of their children, but he's listed as being with them. So it could be they adopted him at some point or took him in, as it were. Lucy will go on to have at least one more child, too. But when Samuel Polk dies, She ends up being enslaved by Samuel Polk's son, Franklin E. Polk, her and her entire family. So in this case, it seems they did try to keep the families together, for better or for worse. A lot of them died. So in 1831, Franklin Polk dies suddenly. His will is about this long. So I don't think he was expecting to die. I don't think anyone was expecting him to die. So he basically says, my brother James K. Polk and my brother-in-law James Walker, just do as you will with my property. So they did. And Lucy ends up becoming the property of Marshall T. Polk here in Charlotte. But she's in Columbia. Marshall T.'s in Charlotte. So did she come back to Columbia, or did she come back to Charlotte in that time? She would have. However, in a strange twist of events, Marshall T. Polk also dies suddenly, just a few months after his brother Franklin Polk. So given the time of year it was, it's winter, we deduce that Lucy and her family did not travel to Charlotte in that time. They were probably waiting for warmer weather. And then when Marshall T. died, there was just, no point in doing that anymore. In Marshall T.'s will, he actually leaves Lucy and her family to his mother, Jane, for the rest of her life, and then to be transferred back to his late wife's care later on. However, this directive was not followed at all, as Lucy and her family are moved to James K. Polk's plantation in Somerville, Tennessee. So note the date is 1832, so this is before he's president. A bit more of a decade before he's president, a little bit more than a decade. So the conditions in Somerville, Tennessee were really, really bad. It had one of the highest instances of runaways in the state. And when you look at James K. Polk's correspondences from that period about that plantation, it's, oh, so-and-so ran away again, had to go chase him down, that kind of thing. So-and-so died. Actually, Lucy loses 2 of her children very close together. She loses her youngest child. We don't know the name of the youngest child. And then 3 months later, she loses her daughter, Sylvia. So it's 2 children that she lost very, very close together. Now, all of that was new information when I was researching. We didn't know Lucy ever went to Somerville, Tennessee. So this was new, and it was tragic, too. So when I got to this part of the research, I really had to put it down and just take a break from it for a little bit. I have 2 children. One of them is back there. And it's really hard to imagine losing your kids to something like that. And in this case, it was really due to a life in bondage that led to this. If Lucy had maybe been born under different circumstances, maybe she wouldn't have lost her children like this. Pneumonia was rampant among the enslaved, TB was rampant, and it's likely they died from that. Also, it was incredibly hot on these plantations, hot like it is today, but then still working very, very hard. There was this really weird belief amongst slave owners that black people held up better under the heat than white people did, which isn't true. Heat affects everybody pretty much the same way. But yeah, so they would work them just as hard as they would, even in cooler weather, which led to a lot of death and disease. So this is a letter from Herbert Biles to James K. Polk, informing him that Lucy's youngest child died on the 16th, and also a little orphan child died as well. So we don't know who the orphan child is. But these are just reports. You get a lot of reports like this from the overseers that are kind of flippant in nature, like, oh, this happened. We should probably buy some more slaves. It's that kind of thing. And then here's another one. Lucy's little girl, Sylvie, died on the 9th of December. So from the same person, Herbert Biles, overseer. Just very much an accounting. There's not a lot of emotion in this, not a lot of, oh, this was sad, or anything. This happened a lot on the plantations. So Lucy was in Somerville with her remaining family for a couple of years. James K. Polk eventually sells this plantation, buys the one in Yallabusha, Mississippi, and then he moves his remaining enslaved people to the Yalabusha plantation. So Lucy and her family, her remaining family, went as well. Lucy had another daughter named Barbara as well, sometimes called Barbary. After they were moved to the Yalabusha plantation, Barbary contracts tuberculosis. And Lucy, understandably so, after losing 2 children, probably to the same disease, was very, very concerned about this. And at this point, her concern must have sparked enough of a reaction for James K. Polk's brother, William H. Polk, who was helping him out to run this plantation, to mention it in a letter. So I'll just read this to you. Barbary had a spell of fever in the summer from which she has not entirely recovered. Her mother, Lucy, says from her complaints of her breast, this is how they talked about tuberculosis, always a complaint of the breast. She fears she is going in the manner of which Alston, Henry, and Charity did, though it may be only the fears of a mother occasioned by the solicitude for her welfare. So it's almost kind of like he's saying, she's just a worried mom. Whatever, yeah. But she had a reason to be worried. She's lost 2 of her children, and now this one seems like she's going to die as well. Fortunately for Barbary, she does recover. However, Lucy contracts tuberculosis in 1838 and sadly passes away from it then. So she was probably in her late 40s, early 50s by this point. So her story is probably the most tragic of the 3. But it does show the reality of slavery, especially slavery on a plantation in the South. So now we can talk about Elias. Elias has a very different kind of story. Elias actually lived long enough to be emancipated. So his life is very different from his mother's, whether his mother be Lucy or Violet, very, very different indeed. So he goes from Charlotte to Columbia. He is eventually enslaved by James K. Polk, and then he's enslaved by President Polk, travels to Washington, D.C. to set up the presidential home in 1845. But President Polk didn't want to keep him at the White House for whatever reason, so he sends him back to Columbia, where he's then leased out to different people for different types of work. Not totally sure what all he did, but there are rental agreements in place regarding Elias Polk. Elias then actually goes back to Washington, D.C. towards the end of his life, and he dies there around the age of 80. Okay, so let's talk about Elias. He was born here on this property to either Lucy or Violet. Don't know which one to know for sure. I do suspect it was Violet, not Lucy, though. Then he goes to 1806 as a newborn. His mother had to bring him there. So imagine him taking a newborn, like probably on your back over the mountains to get to Tennessee. It was probably quite a journey. We also know that Jane Polk had a baby around that time too, a few months before Elias was born. So 2 very little children on this trip to Columbia. In 1824, James K. Polk marries his wife, Sarah Childress. So you might have seen her picture on some of our postcards out there. And then James's parents, as a wedding gift, they sent Elias to James and Sarah's home to serve them. So he became their valet. So a valet is really kind of like a messenger. He drove the wagon, things like that. Okay. In 1845, President Polk is elected as the 11th President of the United States. Nobody saw this coming. It was a big surprise. They thought they were going to elect Martin Van Buren, but President Polk gets elected instead. So Elias travels to Washington, D.C. to assist in setting up the presidential home. But as I said before, he doesn't stay there. President Polk did not want to appear very pro-slavery as a president. So he was very conservative in how many slaves he had in the White House. He did have enslaved people in the White House, but a very low number in comparison to other presidents. He had maybe 2 or 3. However, it's a little bit hypocritical because we know on his plantations, he had between like 50 and 80 at any given time. So he was definitely pro-slavery. He was trying to appear a little bit more on the line there. Okay. In 1849, President Polk passes away. So if you've had a chance to walk around the museum at all, President Polk, he had vowed to serve only one term. He did. He started a war with Mexico, which led to doubling the size of the United States and got us states such as California, Oregon, Washington, a whole bunch of that Midwest area. That is due to President Polk and his policies. So he definitely worked very hard as a president. He was not the president who was fighting on the front lines, though. He was in Washington, D.C. most, if not all of the time. Other people were fighting on the front lines in his wars. Mr. Polk's War is another way of referring to the Mexican-American War. So President Polk, in 1849, he leaves Washington, D.C., goes on a tour of the southern USA, and contracts cholera in Louisiana, where unfortunately he is not going to recover from cholera. He makes it back to his retirement home to see his wife Sarah, who's still in Columbia, Tennessee, but he unfortunately dies and does not really get to enjoy his retirement after that. So at this point, Elias is enslaved by his wife Sarah Polk. Now in 1865, this is kind of following the Civil War, Elias is emancipated. So the Emancipation Proclamation was around 1862, 1863. That's when all the slaves were freed. However, since Elias was in Tennessee at the time, Tennessee was not really considered to be in rebellion, even though it was a Confederate state. So Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves in Confederate states. And in a really weird, twisted, ironic way, that meant that if you had an enslaved person in a Union state, that was allowed to continue. Kind of messed up, but that's what happened. When you get the 13th Amendment in 1865, that's what eventually frees everybody across the United States. Which Abe Lincoln could have included this in his Emancipation Proclamation, but he didn't. So it's likely Elias was not emancipated immediately. He probably had to wait. Now, Elias Polk, as I said, he goes on to have quite the political career. He becomes a porter in the Tennessee State Senate. So porter is kind of like a clerk, more of a clerical job. But he joins the Democrat Party. Now, some people say, why would he join a party that enslaved him? Could be a couple of reasons. It's definitely a debatable topic. We kind of come down on him leveraging the name Polk. It's around this time that you start to see Elias take on the surname Polk. He calls himself Elias Polk. And since he was enslaved by former President Polk, who was a Democrat, he probably had a bit more of an edge in the Democratic Party than he did in the Republican Party. But one of the things about Elias that is very unique is we actually have quotes from him in his own words. He made speeches at the Democratic National Convention. This is just an excerpt from one of his speeches that he made in 1880. I'm just going to go ahead and read this to you. And these are his own words. So it's especially down here at the bottom. I am a Democrat, one of those Jackson, Polk, and Jefferson Democrats, of which there was a round of thunderous applause. It's interesting, right? This is a very complicated man. He has a lot of different layers that we really can unpack a lot. And I can tell you a lot more about Elias Polk. He's written up in the newspapers. He is someone who campaigned on presidential campaigns. He started political clubs for black people. So he was very, very influential. And from all accounts, also very well liked. In 1876, he becomes a laborer in Washington, D.C. This is still a low-level position, but he did go to Washington, D.C. and work. He had been married several times. We're not totally sure what happened to his other wives, but his wife Mary was his third, possibly his fourth wife. She was 40 years younger than him. So it could be he was a little bit of a player, and I don't know, he was good with the ladies, who knows. But then in 1886, Elias dies of pneumonia while on a trip to Washington, D.C. Elias had a goal of meeting every president after President Polk, and he did. He also died on one of those journeys to meet the sitting presidents. And no one expected him to die. It was very sudden. His wife Mary had to ask his former enslaver Sarah to pay for his body to be brought back to Columbia, Tennessee, where he is now buried there. That's where his grave is. In spite of being very popular in the Democratic Party, almost nobody comes to his funeral either. You can ask yourself why. We don't know. It's something to think about. This is a picture of Elias Polk's grave. I got this from Fine Grave Index. It's very blurry, but I promise you this is Elias Polk. And then this is his wife's grave as well. She died just a few years after he did too. She died relatively young. There's always challenges in doing this type of research. Verifying past research, this was very time consuming. There were some inconsistencies in the Enslaved Polks Project, which we're able to rectify. Nothing terrible, just little things here and there. Producing this wayside has also been about a 5-year project, which is a really, really long time to wait to produce the wayside, so we are hoping to get that up relatively soon. Since they sent us back to the drawing board again, I mean, who knows? But hopefully it will happen soon. Also access to primary sources like newspapers, last wills and testaments. This can be really challenging too. I was fortunate in that I was able to contact Maury County Archives. They're located around Columbia, Tennessee. They hold a lot of these documents in their archives, and they were very generous with sending those to me. You know, future plans for the Enslaved Polk Project. We would love, absolutely love, to update our museum exhibit, which has not been updated since the 80s. And if you walk around, you can kind of tell. So we would love to take some of this research and have it in its own section somewhere in our museum, just to give a more well-rounded view of not just the Polks, but other people who were attached to the Polks, like they're enslaved. Also, Indigenous people would be a great thing to include in our museum exhibits. We're also working on an audio tour. It could be some of this information will be parts of the audio tour, if that happens. Then we can also use a lot of this information for public programming. Having a presentation like this is really helpful in getting the information out there while we're waiting for our wayside to be produced. You know, fingers crossed it happens. Yeah, so there's a lot of good things that can happen out of this, and I do feel very privileged to have been a part of it. And it's been quite the journey researching it. So, yeah, any questions I can answer for anyone? No pressure. Yeah.
You were mentioning the plantation in Mississippi. Is that still around?
No, it's not that I can tell.
Yeah.
I was looking for photographs or even a location. I was also trying to see if I could find the location of Lucy's grave. She's buried there somewhere.
Yeah.
So aside from actually going there and, you know, bugging the people who live there, it's going to be really hard to figure it out. Any other questions? Okay. Well, great. And thank you guys for listening so nicely.